had taken steps accordingly, sending the women and children on to the Danube with orders to cross over to an island in the river called the Pt.3. The neighbouring Thracians had also taken refuge on this island upon Alexander's approach, together with Sermus himself and his personal entourage, though the majority of the Trebellians hurriedly retreated to the river from which Alexander had started the previous day. The moment the news of the Trebellians' move reached him, Alexander set off to engage them. He turned in his tracks, retraced his steps, and found them already occupied in pitching camp. The tribesmen, caught napping, prepared to fight in the shelter of the wood by the river, and Alexander, forming his infantry in column, advanced against them with orders to the archers and slingers to proceed in front at the double and discharge their missiles, in the hope of drawing the enemy from the shelter of the wood into open ground. The tribesmen, once they felt the effect of the missiles, came surging forward to get to grips with the lightly armed Macedonian archers, whereupon Alexander, having succeeded in drawing them out of the cover, ordered Philotas to attack their right wing, which was well ahead of the rest of them, with the cavalry from Upper Macedonia. At the same time he instructed Heraclides and Sopolis to advance against the enemy's left with the cavalry from Botiaia and Amphipolis. The main body of infantry, preceded by the rest of his cavalry, he led against the enemy's centre. The Trebellians held their own while the fighting was at long range, but once they had felt the weight and drive of the Macedonian infantry in close order, and the cavalry, instead of shooting at them, had actually begun to ride them down in a fierce assault all over the field, they broke and ran in an endeavour to make their escape through the wood to the river. 3,000 were killed. Only a few of these too were taken alive, because the wood along the river bank was very thick, and there was not enough daylight left for the Macedonians to finish the job properly. According to Ptolemy, the Macedonian losses were 11 men from the cavalry and about 40 from the infantry. 3 days after the battle, Alexander reached the Danube. This river is the largest in Europe. It drains a greater tract of country than any other, and forms the frontier to the territories of some very warlike tribes. Most of them are of Celtic stock. Indeed, the source of the river is in Celtic territory, the most remote being the Quadi and the Marcomanni. Then, flowing east, it passes through the country of the Iazyges, a branch of the Sauromati, of the Geti, the Immortals, of the Sauromati themselves, and finally of the Scythians, where it reaches the end of its course and debouches through 5 mouths into the Black Sea. On the river, Alexander found warships awaiting him. They had come up across the Black Sea from Byzantium. He manned them with heavy infantry and archers, and, sailing for the island to which the Trebellians and Thracians had fled for refuge, attempted to force a landing. Circumstances, however, were against him. The ships met with resistance at every point where they tried to run ashore. They were few in number and not strongly manned. In most places the island shore was too steep for a landing, and the current, sweeping past it through the narrows, was strong and very awkward to deal with. Alexander accordingly withdrew the ships and determined instead to cross the river and attack the Geti, who lived on the further side. A large force of them, some 4,000 cavalry and more than 10,000 on foot, was already assembled on the river bank, evidently prepared to resist a crossing, and the sight of them was one reason for his change of plan. Another was the fact that the idea of landing on the further side of the Danube suddenly seemed attractive. He joined the fleet in person, having left instructions for the tents under which the men bivouacked to be filled with hay, and for all available dugouts to be collected. There were a great many of these boats in the neighbourhood, for they are used by the natives for fishing, and for visiting neighbouring tribes up the river, and, fairly generally, for plundering expeditions. As many as possible of them were collected, and the troops, or as large a part of them as was practicable with this sort of transport, were ferried across. Actually, the number which crossed with Alexander was about 1,500 cavalry and 4,000 infantrymen. The crossing took place at night, and the landing on the riverbank was more or less concealed by a tract of land in which the grain stood high. Just before dawn, Alexander moved forward through the grain field, having given orders that the infantrymen should lead the way to the open ground, clear of crops, beyond, carrying their spears parallel with the ground and obliquely to their line of march, to flatten the grain as they advanced. The mounted troops followed the infantry through the cornfield, but once they were out in clear ground, Alexander took charge of them and led them over to the right wing, at the same time ordering Nicanor to proceed with the infantry in close formation on an extended front. The very first cavalry charge was too much for the Getae. The crossing of the Danube, greatest of rivers, so easily accomplished by Alexander in a single night, without even a bridge, was an act of daring which had shaken them profoundly. And, added to this, there was the violence of the attack itself, and the fearful sight of the phalanx advancing upon them in a solid mass. They turned and fled to their town, which was about 4 miles from the river. But as soon as they saw that Alexander, with his mounted troops ahead, was pressing on along the river bank to avoid ambush or encirclement, they abandoned the town, which had few defences, and taking with them as many women and children as their horses could carry, continued their flight into uninhabited country, as far from the river as they could go. Alexander took the town, together with anything of value which the Getae had left behind. This material was removed to the base by Meleager and Philip, after which the town was razed to the ground, and Alexander offered sacrifice on the banks of the Danube to Zeus the Saviour and Heracles,